Hey guys, before we start, I made this art for Avengers Endgame a couple of years ago along with a short animation. And since I have no one else to really show it to, I'm just going to plop it in front of here and kind of force you to watch it anyway. Sorry. How did the Avengers lose 14 million times? That's a lot of times to get your ass kicked. Insane idea, I know, but today we'll be dissecting the 14,605 outcome plot point in Avengers Infinity War. This sounds like an unfathomably insane number at first, and well, that's because it is. To figure out as many of these outcomes as possible, we gotta at first tackle the logistics of this. And keep in mind, I'm not a logistics guy, but I've had more than enough time to think all of this over. At some point, I will just make some leaps in logic, especially when I get down to the most minor specifics, just to make sense of this chaotic concept. So in short, Doctor Strange looks into the future, sees millions of outcomes and carefully places them in the one where they win. The MCU wiki doesn't state whether you can look through others' perspectives, so I'll just assume he can only look through his own. This will be important later. Strange's main goal is to get to that moment 5 years later where Tony kills Thanos. But what does he have to do to make sure that happens? What factors must be present for that to happen? Scott needs to survive to relay information of the quantum realm and time travel. Tony needs to be alive to invent time travel. Spider-Man probably needs to die to motivate Tony to create time travel. Steve needs to lead the team, get the scepter, acquire extra pin particles and the Tesseract for when they eventually fuck up, and lead the charge against Thanos. Black Widow needs to live to inform the team that there are 3 stones in New York, and she needs to sacrifice herself. Hawkeye needs to live to be the one to sacrifice her. Banner needs to become Professor Hulk and snap his fingers. This is one of the most important ones, by the way. Nebula needs to tell the Avengers where Thanos has gone so they can be informed that the stones were destroyed. She needs to have knowledge of Vormir. She needs to kill her past self to stop her from giving Thanos the Infinity Stones. And her being present does also alert Thanos of what they're doing and their whole plan, so that's a whole can of worms in and of itself. Captain Marvel needs to save Tony and stop Thanos from snapping multiple times. Thor needs to relay information of the Reality Stone. He needs to kill this initial version of Thanos so he's no longer a factor. He needs to bring Mjolnir to the present to save himself and Steve, because let's be honest, he might not have survived this battle without it. He also needs to stop Thanos from getting the stones right here. And everyone else in Endgame is important by proxy. Everyone, no matter how big or small, has a role. Professor Hulk snapping is the most important one because he is the one who brings everybody back. And it takes him years to become Professor Hulk, and therefore the only one strong enough to both physically and mentally bring everyone back. It's not just about pure power, it's about the logistics of the whole business, and being able to mentally fathom bringing everyone back safely. And some guy is probably going to be like, oh, why don't they just stop Thanos from snapping the first time, problem solved. I don't know how to tell you this, brother, but if Strange saw all those millions of outcomes and was so insistent on Tony staying alive, then the snap probably happens in almost every outcome. There are other outcomes where Strange can't be certain of for reasons we'll get into later, but Tony needs to live not only to snap away Thanos but to invent time travel or renovate time travel or whatever the fuck. Meaning in almost all scenarios the snap happens and Tony needs to create time travel to bring everybody back. And to me, the reason is very clearly so Tony can create time travel or renovate or whatever, because this Thanos that he snaps away is from 2014 and is only here because of the Avengers time travel shenanigans. Thor took care of the first one, so the only reason this one is here is because the Avengers time travel in the first place, meaning the Avengers have to time travel at some point. So this was always a long war. There was no outcome where they beat Thanos initially, and the writers have kind of said that this was the point. They lost because they were divided, and they weren't willing to make the sacrifices that Thanos was. If they had just killed Vision right here, the snap wouldn't have happened. Even with the time stone, Thanos would have to go back to points where he hadn't acquired certain stones yet. And even if he isolated himself from that effect, like he does in the film, if Thanos uses the time stone to go back to an earlier point where the Avengers would have killed Vision, there would be 2 versions of certain stones that would exist at that exact point in time. And I don't even want to know what would happen if that was the case. Would that even work? These are all outcomes that derive from their planning on Titan. If Strange had did this back in New York, they probably could have 5 outcomes where they would have won. If Tony and Steve have connected knowing they were each in proximity to an Infinity Stone, they could have stopped Thanos, but they didn't. In a way, this was the point of no return. Their defeat was inevitable. Of course, this whole thing is the biggest leap of logic you could possibly take. Strange would go insane, sane, insane again, would adopt Scientology, would go half insane, an undiscovered type of insane, and then his brain would finally fucking melt before he even reached 1 million. But here's how I interpret what, quote, every possible outcome of the coming conflict means. The fun part is that you can actually take a lot of deleted scenes or concept art and just kind of headcanon it as an alternate timeline. And that kind of does a lot of my job for me already. There's probably timelines out there where Nebula does snap. There's a timeline out there where Strange and Tony do this. And there's a timeline out there where the snap goes like this. There's a timeline where Hulk does come out in Infinity War. There's a timeline where this happens.
Protect the Guardians. Thanos separated their souls from their bodies. If they're out too long, they will die.
I don't know how to fix that.
No, I know you don't, but she does.
There's a timeline where this scene happens. There's a timeline where Strange and Tony's interaction in Endgame goes like this.
Right there. Look who's back. Hey, I remember 5 years ago you ran 15 million futures and one of them worked, yeah? Why don't you tell me how?
If I told you, it wouldn't happen.
Yeah, there's no time for that. Listen to me. Which one wins? Hey, come on, guys!
The alternate action scenes may seem inconsequential, but I'll explain later why they have such a knock-on effect into creating different timelines. Everyone initially probably thinks of outcomes where maybe Star-Lord didn't punch Thanos in the head, or an outcome where someone snaps instead of the Hulk, but really try and wrap your head around the idea of every possible outcome. And keep this in mind, Strange who's desperate to find one where they win. If there's a possibility that Drax slashes Thanos' ankles and one where he slashes Thanos' ass cheeks, that's two different outcomes. Two where either of those options were chosen. Because keep in mind, throwing any significant strike can cause a different reaction. If you punch someone in the head versus punching them in the chest, it could cause a different reaction, which then leads to a different series of actions and outcomes. Just from these two actions alone, they branch out into two different outcomes. Then those singular branches branch out into another series of outcomes. And since this entire plot point confirms that Strange does see Tony snap his fingers, then everything from this point to Tony snapping is subject to change in every minute way possible. But we also have to remember that you can't see past your own death with the time stone. So it's everything from the moment to the moment he vanishes, and then the moment he comes back to the moment Tony kills Thanos. Of course, it doesn't mean everything in the period he's dead in doesn't mean anything, but the former will be more focused on since they're the only points he can directly influence. I'm also assuming Strange is going to pick the outcomes where the least amount of them die. In our timeline, by the end, only Tony, Black Widow, Vision, and Gamora die after his visions. In other outcomes, a lot more of them could die. Even the majority of them could die stopping Thanos. He also can't see past futures where he's one of them, when he's one of them that dies. So even if they did eventually beat Thanos in that timeline, he could never know, so he would just write it off as a defeat. Obviously, I'm not going to sit here for the course of my life and just go through every possible outcome. I probably wouldn't even be able to do it over the course of my life. But from this video, I can at least help some people gain some perspective on how the hell this could even be the case, because there are hundreds of factors within Infinity War and Endgame that could make for one of the 14,605. It makes sense to start from the initial point where Strange sees the outcomes. That means everything about their plan going forward is heavily influenced by this. Therefore, we can take the timeline where they do and don't follow this plan and at least double the amount of branching outcomes within those two outcomes. One where their plan is influenced by what Doctor Strange sees, and one where their plan isn't. So Strange is the first to confront Thanos when he arrives on Titan. There's nothing in what he says that directly indicates that Strange is trying to derive a certain outcome from the exchange. Maybe talking to Thanos and calming him down to catch him off guard leads to the outcome Strange wants. So already we have 3 branched outcomes if you really want to go there. And I don't think people truly understand how much factors into a fight between just 2 people alone. The majority of punches thrown and attacks are completely impulsive, even if there are some grander intent behind them. So you then factor in every hit thrown in this whole fight up to the Star-Lord point, but we'll get to that later, and assume that there's a universe where they choose a different attack. Again, if you just impulsively choose to punch someone in the chest versus punching them in the head, that's a completely impulsive decision, and there's a universe where you choose either of them or none of them. Maybe there's a universe where you kick them in the nuts. So this creates a domino effect leading to different outcomes. Again, if Drax slashes Thanos' ass cheeks opposed to his, whatever this is, inner knee, I think, or something, then that provokes a different reaction and a series of different outcomes. There's also different outcomes that branch if Thanos decides to use a different Infinity Stone every time he uses one. So you could tell the logic has gotten convoluted and messy already very easily. The way I'm going to try and figure this out is taking every significant punch or attack, adding them up, timesing them by the amount of significant attacks thrown after each one. I'm not going to literally try and come up with every outcome myself because I will be real, I'm a little lazy, but I'll at least explain the logic, or at least my logic that I've sort of come up with, so maybe you can do it yourself if you really want to. Again, we're starting from the point where Strange sees what happens and then they fight Thanos. You take every significant strike in this fight, because a significant strike, depending on what one you choose, can lead to a different outcome, like I've said previously. So you take every significant strike, everything that could possibly determine a future outcome. And keep in mind, every one significant strike, a change between one, will result in different branches of outcomes. So you'd have to take every significant strike in this fight, so that means every significant punch or kick or attack or whatever, you'd have to times it by itself. And you can just do that to the point where they get Thanos down, pin him down, and almost get the gauntlet off, because we're about to go into that. Okay, so now we're at to the biggest factor of this, Star-Lord, the Big Ape. Obviously, the outcome most wanted was where they successfully take the glove off of Thanos. Of course, no one here is powerful enough to wield it and use it against him, so imagine in this timeline, they take it as far away from him as possible while the rest hold him back. But based on comments from one of the writers themselves, they probably would have been pretty discouraged to find out that they were still struggling against Thanos without the stones.
Yeah, I mean,
maybe there's nothing they could have done about it.
Thanos trashed half the universe without the stones.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, he went from planet to planet, slaughtering people. He's unbelievably powerful without the stones. I think they would have been very disappointed to get the glove off him and find he was still beating the living daylights out of them.
And who knows, maybe he even kills some of them, and maybe one of them is Strange, you know, resulting in that timeline where we don't see what happens and he writes it off as a defeat. Yes, even without the stones, he could probably do it if he catches Strange off guard, maybe. Once he's like sucked out of Mantis's trance, he hurls Drax into the Guardians with one leg and throws Strange like 30 feet. And this was without the stones, by the way, so we can already see he is very capable without them. But then we gotta guess how many outcomes would derive from this, given the fact that we have no idea what would have happened by using the logic established, because the logic established is based on that fight, but this is an outcome we have any footage or knowledge of or anything, so we have no idea what would happen in this outcome. And in that sense, I would probably just take the numbers from the entire fight before this and add it on to this. So it would be double the amount of numbers, so we could just account for an entirely different conflict on the latter half of this fight. But again, use the logic established previously, count every significant strike times it by itself for the second half of the fight, up to the point where Tony gets stabbed, Strange spares his life, gives Thanos the time stone, Thanos snaps. But as if all of that wasn't fucking complicated enough, you have to factor in the snap into all of this. Half of the population of the entire universe dying seemingly at random by chance. Meaning that there are outcomes out there where everything on Titan and everything leading up to Thanos snapping happens the exact same way, but different people get snapped away and different people are spared. And we already established that every character in Endgame has a vital role in beating Thanos. So if these specific people don't get snapped away, and if these specific people don't stay, then that could lead to a point where they lose to Thanos potentially. And since the snap is allegedly random, if somebody dies before the snap, then somebody else has to take their place. Let's say Star-Lord dies on the Battle of Titan, because Star-Lord is someone who gets snapped away. If Star-Lord dies before that happened, then somebody else has to die in a snap. That could be a Tony Stark, or a Nebula, or a Thor, or a Steve Rogers, or a Natasha Romanoff, or a Bruce Banner. Everybody who is prominent to making sure that the outcome where they win happens. And this is not just limited to the main characters, it is any character in the film, any of the Wakandan soldiers or whatever who dies, somebody would have to take that place in the snap. But since, again, we're assuming that Strange can only see through the eyes of his alternate timeline self with the time stone, we are just going to factor in every life on Titan. If somebody dies on Titan before the snap, then somebody else would get snaps, maybe Nebula or Tony, to take their place, since they were supposed to die in the snap, but the snap needs to half the population, so they would probably be picked by chance to get snapped. But all said and done now, Strange is snapped away, but the vision continues into Endgame. I imagine it was like when you catch yourself dozing off and you jolt back up. I imagine that's what it felt like. Since, based on the way Peter described it, it kind of just probably felt like blacking out but then waking up again suddenly. Strange is clearly the one who orchestrates the whole portals moment, something he probably doesn't do if he doesn't see the visions. He assembles every hero or soldier or warrior across the universe. That itself is 1,000 different factors I'm not even touching with a 10-foot pole. But again, if Strange doesn't see the visions, Strange doesn't do this, which means there's probably a lot of outcomes where Strange doesn't do this. So this is another huge factor that we didn't account for previously, which factors into the Avengers winning. But there's probably a reason Strange doesn't do much in this fight. Again, in every other timeline, they fail, so you'll have to suspend some disbelief to somehow believe that he couldn't just take Thanos without any stones after doing what he did in Infinity War. This tsunami would have factored in greatly, probably to the Avengers' demise, so he spends the entire time stopping that from interfering. He probably saw it was like, okay, this is when I do this, because I saw myself do this, so he'll probably like, okay, this is where I step up and I stop the tsunami, and I can just let everything play out from here. And like we said, every character here is important, from delaying Thanos from getting the gauntlet and snapping long enough for Tony to figure out what he has to do and why Tony specifically. Hulk's injured. Thor is more concerned with the beheading way of going about things. He's also not really mentally sound, as said earlier, when he wanted to wield the gauntlet. Then there's Captain Marvel herself, but ultimately the gauntlet Thanos is wearing is Tony's creation, nanotechnology specifically. He's probably the only one who could seamlessly remove the stones without Thanos noticing, with his armor, and with his armor keeping him alive long enough to snap his fingers. When you think about it, this whole scenario is very curated for Tony to do this. He was the one who created the Infinity Gauntlet in the first place to bring everybody back, and the Infinity Gauntlet being made out of nanotechnology lends to Tony being able to steal the stones without Thanos noticing, and the armor keeps him alive long enough so he can snap and kill Thanos. So this is a very Tony Stark job, and we're probably right in thinking that nobody else could have done it when you really think about it. And the last moment we'll look at where it all really comes to a head is this moment right here when Tony and Strange share their last exchange. The one exchange I think Strange maybe didn't necessarily see through the visions, but was one that was made more out of desperation. He knows this is the moment, and he can't help but give Tony that final nudge to make sure it falls into place. Everything they've ever known is riding on Tony knowing what to do. And since saving his life in Infinity War, I think a part of Tony knew that this life couldn't have been lost too early. I think he knows in his message to Pepper, in case of death, that Strange kept him alive so he could sacrifice his life in a moment like this.